It was day 15 of the Sean Diddy Combs trial. Now everyone was expecting a pretty uneventful day. The prosecution had told the court they'd be going over financial stuff, bank records, how contracts were put together, the way his companies were structured. You know, the kind of technical details that usually make a courtroom pretty empty. In fact, a lot of the regular folks who'd been following the trial decided to skip this one, thinking it would be a bit of a snooze fest. Boy, were they wrong. Suddenly, Marcus Taylor was brought into the courtroom by federal marshals. If you remember the music scene in the early 2000s, Marcus Taylor was a massive star. He had 3 huge hit albums with Bad Boy Records. Then, poof. He vanished from the public eye. Nobody had seen him for nearly 10 years. The moment Taylor appeared, reporters in the courtroom went into a frenzy, grabbing their phones. Within minutes, the half-empty room was packed with journalists and music industry people who'd rushed over. Diddy, who had been calmly looking at documents with his lawyers, just froze. He was mid-sentence. His attorney actually put a hand on his arm, as if to steady him, while Taylor was sworn in. This was a big moment. For the first time during this entire trial, Diddy's usually cool and collected image cracked. You could see it. His face turned red, and his hands balled up into fists. Even the security team near Diddy's table seemed to tense up and inch a little closer. Taylor sat down in the witness stand. He looked calm and dignified, which was a big change from his old image as one of hip-hop's most high-energy performers. He wasn't wearing flashy designer clothes or the bling he was known for. Instead, he had on a simple dark suit. All that old showmanship was gone, replaced by a serious, focused look. The lead prosecutor walked up. "Mr. Taylor," he began, "can you tell the court about your professional history with the defendant?" Taylor leaned into the microphone, his voice clear and strong. "I signed a deal with Bad Boy Records back in 1999. I put out 3 albums with them before I ended my contract in 2008. "And why are you here testifying today?" the prosecutor asked. For the first time, Taylor looked straight at Diddy. "Because what went on at Bad Boy Records wasn't just about making music," he said. "It was about being controlled, about being manipulated. It was a system built to take advantage of young artists. And I think it's time someone finally told the truth about all of it." Now, we need to be clear, everything we're about to share comes straight from what was said in federal court. This is for informational and educational purposes, and some of the details might be sensitive. Nobody saw Marcus Taylor's arrival coming. The courtroom went from 0 to 100 in seconds. What was supposed to be a dull procedural day turned into a high-drama event. Everyone's attention was glued to this man, a former superstar who had disappeared for years, now back and ready to talk about a hidden part of music history. Throughout this trial, Diddy has kept his cool remarkably well. Every day, he'd show up in expensive suits, looking confident, sometimes nodding to people he knew or chatting quietly with his legal team. But seeing Taylor? That was different. Maybe it was because Taylor knew the ins and outs of his business. Or maybe it was seeing an artist he once had total power over, now completely free from his influence. Whatever it was, Diddy's famous composure visibly crumbled as he stared at the man who used to be his protege. Taylor wasn't there trying to get back in the spotlight or as some angry ex-employee with an axe to grind. He was there as someone who had lived through the peak years of Bad Boy Records, seen how it all worked from the inside, and made a conscious choice to walk away from stardom rather than stay in that system. And when he started to speak, his words had the authority of someone who had paid a steep personal price for what he knew. Because what Taylor started to reveal about the contracts, the way the money was handled, the methods of control, and how Bad Boy Records systematically exploited artists, it wasn't just shocking. It painted a picture of an entire business model designed to prey on young, often financially naive artists, many from tough backgrounds. "I need to make one thing absolutely clear right from the start," Taylor said, his voice firm and serious. "This isn't about getting revenge, and I'm not looking for attention. I've deliberately stayed out of the public eye for many years. I'm here because the recent accusations against Mr. Combs sound a lot like the patterns I saw over and over during my time at Bad Boy Records, patterns that hurt many artists, myself included." The judge nodded, letting him go on. The jury was completely focused on this unexpected witness. Diddy's lawyers were huddled together, whispering urgently. They clearly hadn't prepared for this. Bad Boy Records liked to present itself as a family, Taylor continued. The public image was all about success, loyalty, and giving people a shot. But behind closed doors, the reality was very, very different. It was a reality based on tricking people with their money, personal intimidation, and a contract system that frankly felt like a modern form of being trapped and forced to work. It had started like any other day in court. Not many people in the audience, a quiet atmosphere, lawyers getting their papers ready for financial topics. But when the name Marcus Taylor was called, the entire mood shifted. Reporters sat up straighter, and you could see phones being discreetly raised, even though there were rules against it. The energy in the room went from dull to electric. The judge even lifted an eyebrow, clearly surprised by this change from the planned financial testimony. And Diddy? Just moments before, he'd looked almost bored. Now he was sitting bolt upright. His lawyer was trying to whisper something to him, but Diddy seemed like he couldn't hear. His eyes locked on Taylor with a look that the courtroom sketch artist later captured perfectly. A mix of shock knowing who it was and undeniable fear. Taylor walked to the witness stand calmly. No big shows, no trying to impress the crowd. He was completely focused on what he was there to do. Mr. Taylor, the prosecutor started, could you share with the court how you first got involved with Mr. Combs and Bad Boy Records? Taylor nodded. I was performing at a music event in Atlanta back in 1998. I'd been building a name for myself locally for about 3 years. Mr. Combs was there with some of his label executives. After I finished my set, one of his people came up to me and said Mr. Combs was interested in signing me. And what happened after that? Things moved incredibly fast, Taylor explained. The very next week, they flew me to New York. There were meetings, time in the recording studio, talks about my image, how they'd market me. Everyone was so excited about my potential. It honestly felt like my biggest dream was coming true. Taylor described how, as a 19-year-old from a regular working-class family with zero connections in the music industry, all this attention from a huge label felt like proof that his talent and hard work were real. They gave me the contract within 2 weeks of that first meeting, he went on. They said it was a standard artist contract, typical for the industry. They kept telling me it was the same basic agreement all bad boy artists signed. Did you have a lawyer look over this contract? The prosecutor asked. Taylor's face tensed up a bit. I was told that getting my own lawyer would just make things complicated and could even mess up the deal. Mr. Combs himself told me that the label's lawyers were looking out for my best interests, that we were like a family now, and bringing in an outside lawyer would show I didn't trust them. The prosecutor then showed a document. Is this the contract you signed? Taylor confirmed it was. He explained that he was given less than a day to look over a 40-page legal document full of complicated words he didn't understand before he had to sign it. I was 19 years old, Taylor said, his voice quiet. I was staying in a hotel the label paid for, surrounded by their people, and being told this was my one big chance at success. No one explained that I was signing away the rights to my songs, the ownership of my master recordings, and basically putting myself in a situation where I could sell millions of records and still owe the label money. The prosecutor then carefully took Taylor through the important parts of the contract, pointing out clauses about expenses the label could charge back to him, marketing fees, and how the money from sales would be split. With every detail, it became clearer and clearer how unfair the agreement was. When did you start to think that this deal was a problem? The prosecutor asked. Taylor's answer was calm but sharp. After my first album sold over 1 million copies, I should have been set financially. Instead, they told me I still owed the label more than $1 million. I need to be very clear about something, Taylor stated, his voice unwavering but strong. I've sold millions of albums. I've had #1 hit songs. I've performed to sold-out stadiums all over the world. But for years, financially, I was living paycheck to paycheck, relying on whatever advance money the label decided to give me. He glanced quickly at Diddy before adding, because no matter how successful my music was, the accounting books always showed I owed them more. Taylor explained that his first album sold over 2 million copies and had 3 hit singles. Normally, this should have meant he'd earn a lot in royalties. When I asked to see a detailed breakdown of the money, he said, they first told me it was being worked on. Then, they said it was too complicated for me to understand. Finally, they gave me a statement that showed, Even though the album was a huge success, I had only paid back a tiny part of what I supposedly owed the label. The prosecutor put a financial statement up on the courtroom screens. "Is this the document you received?" Taylor confirmed it was. He pointed out the long list of expenses they charged him for: studio time at rates much higher than usual, marketing costs they couldn't prove, production expenses that seemed way too high, and even charges for label parties and events he hadn't even gone to. But the most upsetting part wasn't just the shady accounting, Taylor continued. It was what happened when I started asking questions. He described how, at first, they just brushed off his concerns, saying the music business was complicated. But when he kept asking, their approach changed. Mr. Combs invited me to his house for what he called a family meeting, Taylor recalled. He was very charming at first, talking about how far we'd come together, stressing how much the label had invested in me. But when I kept pushing him about the money problems, his whole attitude changed. Taylor described how Diddy then reminded him about other artists who had left Bad Boy and then disappeared from the music scene. He talked about his wide-ranging connections in music, radio, TV, and even outside of entertainment. "He never directly threatened me," Taylor clarified. "He didn't have to. The message was crystal clear. My career depended on him, and if I challenged the system, that career could vanish." The prosecutor then showed another document, an email from Diddy to several executives about Taylor I.'s questions regarding the accounting. "I've never seen this before," Taylor said, looking it over, "but it confirms exactly what I went through." The email, from 2003, told executives to deal with the Taylor situation by changing how his debt was calculated and reminding him of his contract duties. It specifically mentioned making an example of him to make sure other artists stayed focused on music and not on business. Taylor went on, explaining how after that meeting, his relationship with the label subtly but noticeably shifted. It became harder to get studio time. His second album got less marketing support, and radio promotion was delayed. "It was never said outright," Taylor explained, "but it was obvious. The more questions I asked, the more roadblocks appeared in my career." He described how, even with these challenges, his second album was still a big commercial success, though not as big as his first. "After that album," Taylor said, "I got another accounting statement. This one showed I owed even more than before. When I compared the statements, I found out they had added interest to my debt and even added new types of expenses going back in time." The prosecutor displayed both statements side by side, highlighting the differences. "At that point, I hired an independent financial expert, someone with no ties to the music industry," Taylor continued. "I paid them myself and kept it completely secret. Their finding was that based on actual sales and normal industry practices, he should have made about $4.2 million from his first two albums. Instead, he had only received about $185,000 in advances, while building up a paper debt of over $2 million. The courtroom was dead silent as everyone took in the meaning of this. Taylor looked directly at Diddy. "This wasn't just happening to me," he said firmly. "This was how they did business." Taylor took a sip of water as the prosecutor led him to talk more about the general patterns he saw during his time at Bad Boy Records. "The financial tricks were just one part of a bigger system," Taylor explained. "There was a whole setup designed to keep artists under control, not just through contracts." He described how the label methodically made artists dependent on them in many areas of their lives, not just professionally but personally too. Housing, transportation, even personal relationships were watched and often managed by label staff. Taylor stated, "New artists were encouraged to live in properties owned by Mr. Combs or his business partners. Our whereabouts were tracked, supposedly for security or scheduling. Our personal teams, stylists, security, even sometimes who we dated, were often chosen by the label or had connections to it." The prosecutor showed several employment contracts for members of Taylor's team, his personal assistant, security guards, and stylist. Each contract had unusual clauses requiring them to give regular updates to label management about Taylor's activities, who he met, and what he talked about. "I had no idea these clauses existed," Taylor said, looking at the documents. "These were people I trusted with my everyday life, and they were contractually obligated to spy on me for the label." He explained how this surveillance created an atmosphere where artists never felt truly free to voice concerns or look at options outside the bad boy world. "The isolation was deliberate," Taylor continued. "We were constantly told that the bad boy family was all we needed, that outsiders wouldn't understand our world, and that being loyal to Mr. Combs was the key to ongoing success. Taylor described how artists who tried to be too independent, whether with their music, their money, or their personal lives, often found themselves subtly pushed to the side. Album release dates would get pushed back, radio promotion would mysteriously dry up, and opportunities would just disappear. There was a clear pattern of which artists did well in that system, he noted. Those who accepted the financial setup without question, who stayed personally loyal to Mr. Combs, who went along with the label is culture without complaining, they got the full force of the bad boy marketing machine. Those who pushed back in any way ran into coincidental career problems. The prosecutor then presented some internal bad boy communications. These messages discussed artists who had raised concerns similar to Taylor's. The documents showed clear strategies to manage expectations, realign priorities, and in one instance, make an example of an artist who had been especially outspoken about wanting financial transparency. The most clever part of this whole system was how it was disguised as family, as mentorship, as protection in a tough industry, Taylor explained. Mr. Combs presented himself as both a father figure and a business genius. He would emphasize how he was shielding us from the bad guys in the industry, how his tough methods were preparing us for the realities of the music business. Taylor described how this framing made it especially hard for young artists to see they were being manipulated. When you're 19 or 20 years old coming from a background with few opportunities, and you have someone like Diddy telling you he's looking out for you, someone whose success is undeniable, who seems to represent everything you want to achieve, the power difference is huge. Questioning his methods feels like being ungrateful, like disrespecting the person who gave you your big break. He paused, his face serious. It took me years to realize that what they called protection was actually control, what they called mentorship was exploitation, and what they called family was really about ownership. The court took a short break. When they came back, Taylor was on the stand again. He was still composed, but you could sense a shift in his energy as the prosecutor started asking about why he left Bad Boy Records. Mr. Taylor, after putting out 3 successful albums with Bad Boy, you ended your relationship with the label in 2008. What made you decide to do that? Taylor sat up a little straighter. By the time I was on my 3rd album, I had started to build relationships with entertainment lawyers and financial advisors who were separate from the label's circle. I was very careful to keep these connections private, because I knew how they reacted before when I asked about business matters. He explained that through these independent advisors, he got a much clearer picture of just how unfair his contract terms were compared to normal industry standards, and how systematically the accounting had been messed with. But the real final straw wasn't actually about my own situation, Taylor said. It was about seeing what was happening to the newer artists signing with the label. He described how, in 2007, he watched several new bad boy artists go through the signing process. These were young performers from backgrounds like his, clearly overwhelmed by suddenly being thrown into the industry. I watched them being led through the exact same process I had gone through, he said. The same pressure to sign the contract quickly without getting their own lawyer, the same promises about family and loyalty, the same contract terms that would make sure they never got fair pay for their work. Taylor then told a story about one specific incident that made up his mind. A young artist, barely 18, had shown some hesitation about certain parts of the contract. Taylor saw Diddy's reaction himself. Mr. Combs took this kid into his office privately. When they came out about an hour later, the young man looked totally different, quiet, almost scared. He signed the contract right away without asking any more questions. Taylor paused. Later that night, at a label party, this same artist pulled me aside and asked if I could lend him money for his mother's overdue rent. This was right after he'd signed a contract that was publicly announced as a multi-million-dollar deal. When I asked him what happened in the meeting with Diddy, he just shook his head and said, "I can't talk about it. I just need to focus on the music." Taylor described how this moment forced him to face his own part in keeping the system going. I realized I had become part of the problem. By staying with Bad Boy, even though I knew how it operated, I was making a system that would keep exploiting young artists look legitimate. My success, even though I wasn't seeing the money from it, was being used to lure new talent into the same trap. The prosecutor nodded. And what did you do after this realization? I talked to a lawyer about my options for getting out of my contract, Taylor replied. I was told that legally fighting the agreement would mean years of expensive court battles that I couldn't afford. The other option was to buy my way out of the contract, basically paying for my freedom with money I had earned but never actually received. Taylor explained that he sold personal belongings, borrowed money from family, and worked out a deal that let him leave his contract early. The cost was huge, he said, not just financially, but for my career too. Part of the agreement to leave included strong non-disparagement clauses and confidentiality rules. I was effectively silenced from talking about my experiences publicly. Also, I understood, though it was never said out loud, that choosing to leave would likely be the end of my mainstream music career. "And what happened to your career after you left Bad Boy Records?" the prosecutor asked. "Exactly what I thought would happen," Taylor replied. "Doors slammed shut, opportunities vanished. Industry contacts suddenly weren't available. I released music independently, but without major label backing for distribution or promotion, I couldn't sell much." He looked straight at the jury. "I chose freedom over fame, knowing what it would cost me, but I have never regretted that decision." With that, the prosecution finished their questions. Then, Diddy's lead defense attorney stood up to cross-examine Taylor. He came on strong, trying to make Taylor's testimony sound like it was just the ramblings of a bitter, failed artist. "Mr. Taylor, you've painted quite a dramatic picture of your time with Bad Boy Records," the attorney began, his tone very dismissive. "But isn't it true that your career went downhill not because of some big conspiracy, but simply because people stopped liking your music?" Taylor stayed calm. "My third album with Bad Boy still went gold and had a top 10 single, even with very little promotional help. The public was still interested. What changed wasn't the quality of my music or what the audience wanted. It was my access to the industry's support system." The defense lawyer then tried a different angle, showing sales numbers that indicated Taylor's album sales had decreased with each release. "These numbers tell a different story, don't they? Each album sold less than the one before it. Isn't that the real reason you left? You were becoming less valuable to the label." "Those numbers are correct, but they don't tell the whole story," Taylor responded smoothly. "My first album got the full promotional treatment from Bad Boy, a great release date, a huge marketing budget, top priority for radio play. With each following album, as I started asking more questions about the business side, those resources were strategically cut back. The drop in sales was because of less support, not because the music was worse or the audience wasn't there." The courtroom was tense as the defense attorney's questions got sharper, suggesting Taylor was only testifying because he was angry about a failed career and money problems. "Isn't it more likely that you're here because your independent career never took off like it did with Bad Boy, and now you're looking for someone else to blame?" Taylor took a beat before answering, still perfectly composed. "I knew what the professional fallout would be when I left. I chose truth over more commercial success. I've lived a modest but steady life as an independent musician and producer for the last 15 years. I'm not in financial trouble. I'm not trying to make a comeback or get publicity. I was subpoenaed to be here, and I'm telling the truth." The defense then changed tactics again, this time focusing on how common certain music industry contract terms are. "The things you've described, recoupable expenses, marketing costs, how revenue is split, these are pretty standard in the music industry, aren't they? Bad Boy's practices weren't that unusual." "Certain ways of doing things are indeed common," Taylor acknowledged. "What was not common was the extent of the financial manipulation, the deliberate effort to keep artists away from independent advice, and the coordinated attempts to shut down any questions or requests for transparency. The problem wasn't just the contract terms themselves, but the entire environment that stopped artists from understanding or challenging those terms." Throughout the increasingly aggressive questioning, Taylor kept his cool. He admitted when there were things he didn't know from his perspective but stood strong on the main points of his testimony. In a final attempt to make him look bad, the defense attorney showed several photos of Taylor at industry events years after he left Bad Boy. Some even showed him looking friendly with Diddy. These don't look like the actions of someone who felt victimized or exploited. How do you explain staying on friendly terms with Mr. Combs if your experience was as terrible as you claim? Taylor looked at the photos, then looked directly at Diddy for the first time since the cross-examination started. "Survival," he said simply. "The music industry is a small world. Mr. Combs's influence is massive. A public fight would have destroyed what was left of my career. Those photos show a professional understanding that you sometimes have to keep up appearances, no matter what the private reality is. He continued, his voice steady but with more force. But more importantly, those photos show something else. They show the power imbalance that defined my entire relationship with Bad Boy Records. Even years after leaving, even after meeting all my contract obligations and paying for my freedom, I still had to be careful around Mr. Combs' influence. I still had to manage how he saw me, just to protect what little career I had left. Taylor turned back to the defense attorney. That reality, the need to keep up appearances with someone who exploited you because their power over your ability to make a living goes far beyond any formal business deal. That is exactly what this case is about. The defense attorney had no more questions. When Marcus Taylor finally left the witness stand after more than 4 hours of testimony, the entire feel of the courtroom had changed. What started as a day for boring financial documents had turned into possibly the most important day of the entire trial. Diddy sat stiffly at the defense table. His face, usually so expressive, was now like a stone mask, trying to show no emotion. His legal team was huddled together, whispering urgently, their worried expressions clear to see. For the very first time in this trial, the defense looked truly rattled. The prosecution had scored a major win. Taylor's testimony connected all the individual accusations into a clear picture of how Bad Boy allegedly did business, told by someone who had lived it firsthand. Taylor hadn't just aired his personal complaints. He had carefully laid out the operational details of the exploitation that he claimed was at the heart of Bad Boy Records' way of managing artists. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was instant and huge. Music industry news outlets rushed out breaking news. Social media exploded with courtroom sketches and comments from legal experts. Suddenly, other former Bad Boy artists were getting swamped with interview requests. Their old complaints, which might have been dismissed before, were now being seen in a new, more credible light. Taylor himself left through a side door, not making any statements to the press. His lawyer just said, "Mr. Taylor testified truthfully about things he personally knows. He has no more public comments right now." The impact on the music industry was like an earthquake. Entertainment lawyers said they were getting calls from artists wanting their contracts reviewed. Several major record labels put out statements saying they were committed to being transparent with money and treating artists fairly. Industry groups announced plans for programs to help new artists understand their contract rights. Most importantly, other former Bad Boy artists started to speak up. Some went public, others shared their stories anonymously through lawyers. Many of them backed up Taylor's descriptions of financial manipulation, systematic control, and career damage for asking questions. For Diddy, this presented a huge strategic problem. Unlike accusations that could be brushed off as personal fights or one-off incidents, Taylor's testimony pointed to systematic business practices, Bad Boy's own records, financial statements, contract language, internal emails, now looked different. They could be seen as potential proof of deliberate exploitation, not just standard industry stuff. Legal experts pointed out that this could go beyond the current charges. One entertainment lawyer told the cameras, "What we heard today could open the door for many former artists to sue for damages." The time limit for fraud cases can be extended if there's evidence that financial information was deliberately hidden, which is exactly what this testimony suggested. As day 15 of the trial ended, the judge gave the jury new instructions about how to consider expert testimony on industry practices. This suggested that Taylor's account had significantly changed how the case would be viewed. The trial will go on, but the story has fundamentally shifted. What the defense had tried to paint as isolated accusations against a successful businessman was now being framed as evidence of a systematic business model built on intentionally exploiting young talent. A model that Marcus Taylor's testimony had blown wide open from the inside,